Sirens never sound like they do in the movies. They don't wail heroically. They scream like a dentist's drill, grinding against an exposed nerve. When my sister gripped my forearms and begged me to take the fall for her little drunk driving accident, I smiled. I remembered the exact porous texture of the concrete cell from my last life. I remembered dying there for her. So this time I said yes. Let her watch what happens when a misdemeanor turns into homicide. Sour tequila and stomach acid. That was the first thing that hit my senses, cutting through a fog so thick it felt like I was drowning in wet wool. A sharp stabbing pain radiated beneath my left rib cage. I gasped, my hands instinctively flying to my side to stem the warm, sticky flow that wasn't there. My fingers met only the soft, worn cotton of my oversized sleep shirt. No puncture wound. No cold prison floor beneath my cheek. No rhythmic thud of a guard's boots echoing down cell block 4. Instead, there was the low, steady hum of our kitchen refrigerator, the smell of bleach from the countertops, the glaring sterile light of the overhead fluorescent bulb that always flickered when it rained. Nora, Nora, are you even listening to me? Acrylic nails dug into my bare arms. Sharp, frantic, I blinked, my vision swimming into focus. Sabrina stood in front of me. Her mascara was smeared beneath her eyes, clumping in the fine lines she spent hundreds of dollars trying to erase. She smelled of lime wedges, expensive floral perfume, and the distinct sour odor of raw panic. Her blonde hair, usually blown out to perfection, stuck to her sweaty forehead. I stared at her. The vertigo of being violently yanked backward through time made the room tilt. My knees buckled slightly, my feet catching the edge of the linoleum tile to keep myself upright. I was 23 again, not 30, not bleeding out on a concrete floor with a sharpened toothbrush buried in my lung. I didn't mean to. Sabrina babbled, her voice hitting that high nasal pitch it always did when she wanted something. It was dark. The street lights on Elm were out. I swear to God, Nora, I barely tapped it. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. My throat felt raw tight with the ghost of a scream I hadn't screamed yet. Tapped what SAB? I asked. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. Raspy hollow. A parked car. She sobbed, releasing my arm to cover her face. It was a practice gesture. She always looked beautiful when she cried, making sure her face wasn't completely obscured so you could see her trembling lip. Just a stupid parked car, but I panicked. I drove off. She dropped her hands, her blue eyes wide, pleading, finding mine. I had 3 margaritas. Nora, maybe 4. If the cops find me, they'll breathalyze me. I'll get a DUI. My residency at Johns Hopkins. They'll pull it. They do background checks. You know they do. I knew exactly what she was going to ask. I knew because she had asked it before, in another lifetime, a lifetime that felt like a fading nightmare. I had stood in this exact spot. I had argued with her. I had cried. I had lectured her about responsibility. And then slowly, agonizingly, I had folded under the weight of her tears, an ingrained, lifelong habit of protecting the family's golden child. I had taken the keys. I had taken the blame, and that parked car had turned out to be a vehicle belonging to a local judge. The hit and run charge had ballooned. Sabrina had hired me a cheap public defender, promising to pay for a better one later. A promise she never kept. I went to prison. She went to Baltimore. I looked at her hands. They were shaking, not with guilt, I realize now, but with the terrifying prospect of facing consequences for the first time in her 22 years of life. Say you were driving. She whispered the words rushing out of her in a desperate exhale. Please, you haven't had anything to drink. You just went out to get milk or something. It's just a fender bender. Insurance will cover it. You'll get a ticket, maybe a fine. I'll pay it. I swear I'll pay every cent. The silence in the kitchen stretched heavy and suffocating. The rain beat against the glass of the back door. I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. It wasn't a happy expression. It felt tight, almost painful, stretching over muscles that hadn't smiled in 7 years. The sheer unadulterated selfishness of her standing there asking me to absorb her mistake like a sponge was almost breathtaking. Okay, I said. Sabrina froze. The frantic energy drained out of her, replaced by stunned confusion. Okay, she echoed. You will. Sure, I said, keeping my voice deadpan. I reached out and gently pried the heavy ring of car keys from her sweaty palm. The metal was warm. I was driving. I went out for milk. I hit a parked car. She threw her arms around my neck, burying her wet face in my shoulder. Oh my God, Nora, thank you. Thank you. You're saving my life. I owe you everything. Her embrace felt like a snare pulling tight around my chest. I didn't hug her back. I just stood there staring blankly over her shoulder at the humming refrigerator. Go wash your face, I told her quietly. Brush your teeth. You smell like a distillery. If the cops come, you need to look like you've been asleep. She pulled back, nodding vigorously, wiping the snot from her upper lip. Right, yes, you're right. She turned and skewered toward the hallway, her bare feet slapping wetly against the linoleum. I stood alone in the kitchen, tossing the keys in my hand. They jingled sharply. I felt a phantom ache in my ribs again, right where the shiv had gone in. I took a deep, shuddering breath of the bleach-scented air. I wasn't going to die for her this time. This time, I was going to help her dig her own grave, and I was going to hand her the shovel. Waiting is a physical sensation. It crawls under your skin and makes your joints itch. I sat on the edge of the living room sofa, my hands resting on my knees. The fabric of the couch was rough, a cheap weave that scratched against my bare legs. I hadn't changed my clothes. I was still wearing the oversized band t-shirt and loose cotton shorts I'd fallen asleep in. Sabrina came back downstairs 15 minutes later. She had scrubbed her face clean, pulled her hair into a messy bun, and changed into a pair of matching silk pajamas. She looked exactly like a stressed, innocent graduate student who had just been woken up in the middle of the night. She paced the length of the living room carpet, her jaw clenched. Did anyone see you? I asked, my voice slicing through the thick silence. Sabrina jumped, startled. What? I don't know. It was dark. The rain was coming down so hard. But you're sure it was just a parked car? I pressed. I needed to hear her say it again. I needed to memorize the exact shape of her lie. Yes, she snapped, irritation flaring in her eyes. It was a familiar look. How dare I question her even as I was supposedly saving her? A green sedan parked half on the curb. Nobody was in it. Right, a green sedan. Headlights swept across the living room wall, casting long, distorted shadows of the window blinds across the ceiling. The heavy crunch of tires rolling over the gravel driveway followed. Sabrina stopped pacing. Her breath hitched there here. She whispered to go sit in the armchair. I instructed, look tired. Don't speak unless they speak to you. I walked to the front door, my bare feet sinking into the entryway rug. I didn't wait for them to knock. I pulled the door open just as the heavy footsteps reached the porch. 2 officers stood under the yellow porch light. The rain was blowing sideways, misting their dark uniforms. The younger one, a stocky guy with a buzz cut, held a heavy Magite flashlight. His utility belt squeaked against his hip as he shifted his weight. Nora Gallagher, the older officer asked. His badge read, Hayes. He looked bored. Water dripped from the brim of his cap. Yes, I said. I let my shoulders slump, forcing a tremor into my hands. It wasn't hard. The residual adrenaline of being reborn was still wreaking havoc on my nervous system. I asked their silver Honda Civic registered to this address. Hayes asked, clicking his pen, yes. I said, it's my sister's car. Sabrina materialized behind me, clutching the lapels of her silk pajama top. I asked something wrong. Officer, she asked, her voice trembling perfectly, a masterclass in vulnerability. Hayes looked past me to her. Are you the owner of the vehicle? Ma'am. Yes, Sabrina Gallagher. But I haven't been out all night. I've been studying. She pointed a shaky finger at me. Nora borrowed it. Hayes turned his tired eyes back to me. Care to tell us where you were about an hour ago? Nora. I dropped my gaze to the wet wood of the porch. I went out to get something to eat. I mumbled. I turned down Elm Street to avoid the traffic on the bypass. The rain was so heavy I couldn't see, and Hayes prompted a hint of impatience bleeding into his tone that I hit something. I confessed, letting out a ragged breath. A parked car. A green one, I think. I heard the crunch, but I panicked. I just kept driving. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do. Sabrina let out a soft, dramatic gasp, covering her mouth with her hand. Oh, Nora, why didn't you tell me I knew the front bumper looked dented when I went to get a glass of water? But I thought she trailed off, letting the cops fill in the blanks of my supposed guilt. The younger officer spoke up, his voice unexpectedly sharp. You sure you hit a parked car, ma'am? Positive, I said, looking him dead in the eye. It was parked on the right side of the street. Nobody was around. Hayes sighed, closing his small notebook. All right, we're going to need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. Hit and run is a serious offense. Miss Gallagher, that I understand, I said meekly. I'll come with you. Sabrina offered quickly, stepping forward. I need to call her parents. I need to make sure she has a lawyer. That won't be necessary right now, Hayes said, holding up a hand. But you will need to follow us down to sort out the impound paperwork for your vehicle. Sabrina paused slightly. Impound, but it's just a scrape. Standard procedure. Hayes grunted. They walked me out into the rain. The cold drops hitting my skin felt intensely real. A sharp contrast to the phantom memories of prison heat. The younger officer opened the back door of the cruiser. The smell of cheap air freshener sweat and old vinyl washed over me. I slid into the hard plastic seat, my knees pulled tightly together. Through the rain-streaked window, I watched Sabrina jog to her battered silver Civic. She looked terrified, but beneath the terror, there was a rigid set to her jaw. The look of someone who thought they had successfully passed the buck. As the police cruiser pulled out of the driveway, the radio on the dashboard crackled to life. A dispatcher's voice cut through the static tight and urgent. I couldn't make out all the words, but I caught enough. Huss, coroner is en route to Elm. Secure the perimeter. I leaned my head back against the cold, damp plexiglass divider. The plastic dug uncomfortably into my scalp. I closed my eyes, letting the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers lull me into a state of absolute chilling calm. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for it to snap shut. The precinct felt like a sensory deprivation tank built out of cinder blocks. The air conditioning was cranked so high it made the moisture on my skin turn to frost. I was sitting in an interrogation room. A small windowless box with a metal table bolted to the floor and 2 plastic chairs. The scuff marks on the linoleum told stories of 1,000 panicked people kicking their feet in desperation. I wasn't kicking. I sat perfectly still. My hands were folded on the cool metal table. A paper cup of water, softening at the brim, sat untouched in front of me. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with the angry, erratic energy of a dying wasp. It had been an hour. They had taken my fingerprints, the ink smelling sharp and chemical, and escorted me here without another word. Hayes was gone. He was a patrolman. You don't leave a patrolman with a suspect when a traffic accident turns into a crime scene. The heavy metal door clicked open, groaning on its hinges. A man walked in. He didn't look like Hayes. He wore a rumpled gray suit that looked like he had slept in it, and a dark blue tie loosened at the collar. He carried a manila folder thick with paperwork. He smelled intensely of black coffee-stale cigarette smoke, clinging to his wool jacket and peppermint gum. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down heavily, tossing the folder onto the table. It made a loud slapping sound. Sir, Nora, he said. His voice was grawly, worn down by years of speaking to liars. I'm Detective Miller, detective. I repeated, letting my voice waver just a fraction. For a parked car. Miller didn't smile. He opened the folder, flipped past a few sheets of paper, and pulled out a photograph. He didn't show it to me. He just looked at it for a long moment before looking back at me. Walk me through it again, he said, folding his hands over the open file. From the moment you left your house. I took a shaky breath, playing the part. I was hungry. I took Sabrina's keys from the kitchen counter. I got in the car. It was raining really hard. Did you adjust the seat? Miller asked casually. What the seat? Nora, your sister is what? 5 feet 2 inches. You're easily 5 feet 9 inches. Did you push the seat back before you drove? I hesitated, letting a look of confusion wash over my face. This was it, the first deliberate mistake. No, I said quietly. I was in a hurry. I just squeezed in. My knees were practically hitting the dashboard. Miller stared at me. His eyes were pale blue, sharp, and unblinking. He made a small sound in the back of his throat, a non-committal hum. He made a note on his pad. Okay, you squeezed in. You drove down Elm. Then what? I was messing with the radio. I lied seamlessly, trying to find a station. I took my eyes off the road for a second. The street lights were out. Before I knew it, I smashed into the back of a green car. I hit the steering wheel hard. The steering wheel, Miller repeated. Yes, I rubbed my chest right over my sternum, mimicking pain. It knocked the wind out of me. I panicked. I put the car in reverse and sped off. I'm sorry, I was just so scared. Miller leaned back in his chair. The plastic creaked under his weight. He looked at me for a long, agonizing minute. The buzzing of the lights seemed to grow louder, filling the silence in the room. You're lying. Nora, he said quietly. I widened my eyes, forcing a look of indignant shock that I'm not. I swear I hit it. I'll pay for the damages. Just give me the ticket. Mil aside, running a hand over his exhausted face. Let me tell you what our forensics team found in your sister's car about 20 minutes ago. He flipped the photograph around and slid it across the metal table. It was a close-up of the driver's side seat belt of Sabrina's silver Civic. Against the gray fabric, there was a distinct dark smear. The driver's seat of the Civic was pushed all the way forward, Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, losing any trace of conversational warmth. Set perfectly for someone with a short inseam, not someone 5 feet 9 inches. Furthermore, when my officers examined you in intake, they noted you didn't have a single abrasion on your left collarbone. If you hit a car hard enough to cave in a bumper, the seat belt locks. It bruises. I stared at the picture, keeping my breathing shallow, acting trapped. I don't. But you know what else they found on that seat belt? Miller interrupted, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the table. Blood. Not yours. Not your sister's. The door behind him opened. It wasn't closed all the way. Through the crack, I could hear the chaotic noise of the precinct bullpen, telephones ringing, people shouting, and then I heard Sabrina's voice. Where is she? I demand to see my sister. You can't keep my car. I need it for school. Miller ignored the noise outside. He kept his eyes locked on mine. That green sedan you supposedly hit on Elm Street. Miller said, his voice deadly quiet now. It wasn't empty and it wasn't parked. It was idling in the middle of the intersection. The owner of that car was a 24-year-old man named Leo Vance. The name hit me like a physical blow, even though I had suspected it. Leo, Sabrina's on-again, off-again boyfriend. The one she fought with constantly. The one she screamed at over the phone just 3 hours before she came home covered in rain and panic. Leo Vance is dead. Nora, Miller stated brutally. He wasn't killed by the impact of the crash. He was beaten to death with a blunt object, likely a tire iron, before his car was struck. I let out a perfectly timed, horrifying gasp. I pressed both hands over my mouth, my eyes wide with terror. I didn't have to fake the adrenaline rushing through my veins. Miller stood up. He walked to the door and pulled it wide open. Sabrina was standing by the intake desk arguing with a tired-looking sergeant. She turned at the sound of the door opening her eyes, locking onto Miller and then onto me sitting behind the metal table. Miss Gallagher, Miller called out, his voice booming over the noise of the precinct. Step inside, please. Sabrina faltered. The arrogant, annoyed mask she wore slipped, revealing the raw, unadulterated panic underneath. She took a hesitant step toward the interrogation room, her eyes darting nervously between the detective and me. What's going on? She demanded, her voice wavering. Did she sign the confession? Can we go home? Miller stepped back, allowing her to enter the freezing room. He shut the heavy metal door behind her with a definitive echoing clang. Your sister was just telling me about the accident. Sabrina, Miller said, crossing his arms over his chest. She told me a very interesting story. Only the physical evidence in your car tells a completely different one. Sabrina looked at me. Nora, what did you say? She hissed, panic, raising the pitch of her voice. I looked up at her, letting my hands drop from my face. I gave her a look of utter, devastated betrayal. I told them what you told me to tell them. SAB, I whispered, my voice breaking. I told them I was driving. Sabrina whirled on the detective. See, she confessed she was driving. I was asleep. The driver's seat was adjusted for your height. Sabrina, Miller stated coldly. The steering wheel has traces of your lotion on it. But more importantly, the blood transfer on the driver's side seat belt is a match to the victim. Sabrina's face drained of all color. It was like watching a ghost manifest in real time. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Victim. She finally choked out the word, scraping out of her dry throat. It was a parked car. It was Leo Vance's car. Miller corrected her, taking a step toward her. Sabrina physically recoiled her back, hitting the concrete wall of the room. And Leo Vance was murdered tonight. Blunt force trauma to the skull. We found a bloodied tire iron tossed in the storm drain 50 feet from the crash site. Sabrina's knees gave out. She literally collapsed, sliding down the cinder block wall until she hit the scuffed linoleum floor. She grabbed her head, her fingers digging into her messy blonde bun. No, she whimpered a guttural, ugly sound. No, no, no. He was supposed to just, she caught herself, biting down on her lip, so hard a bead of blood welled up. Miller leaned over her. He was supposed to what? Sabrina. I sat quietly at the metal table, watching the mascara run down her cheeks, watching the flawless veneer of my golden sister shatter into a million jagged pieces. The phantom ache in my ribs was entirely gone. In its place, a cold, dark satisfaction bloomed, taking root in the very center of my chest. She wanted me to take the fall for a traffic ticket. Now she was going to drown in a murder charge. She couldn't escape, tangled in the very lie she forced me to tell. Sabrina's hyperventilation filled the small interrogation room. A wet, rhythmic gasping that sounded like a dying fish slapping against the bottom of a boat. She had her knees pulled to her chest on the scuffed linoleum, rocking slightly. The silk of her expensive pajamas clung to her sweat-dampened skin. I watched her from my hard, plastic chair. I didn't move to comfort her. I didn't speak. I just listened to the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a low electric hum that felt like a tuning fork vibrating at the base of my skull. I didn't. Sabrina choked out her voice, barely a whisper. She looked up at Detective Miller, her mascara creating deep, bruised hollows under her eyes. We argued. Yes, we argued. But I left. I just left him there. Where is there? Sabrina, Miller asked. He didn't bend down to her level. He stood over her, a mountain of rumpled gray wool and stale coffee breath. Because your boyfriend's skull was caved in 3 blocks from his apartment in the pouring rain, and your car just happened to rear end his idling vehicle right after. He followed me. Sabrina shrieked the sudden volume, making the paper cup on my table vibrate. I left his place, and he followed me. He was screaming at me from his window at the stop sign, calling me, she choked on the word, her pristine image of herself wearing with the ugly reality tumbling out of her mouth. Calling you what? Miller pressed his tone devoid of an ounce of pity. A whore. Sabrina sobbed, burying her face in her knees. Because I told him I was transferring my residency to Boston. I told him I was leaving him behind. He got out of his car. He came at my window. He punched the glass. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the cool metal table. The narrative was taking shape. A messy, violent lover's quarrel in the dead of night. It was so agonizingly common. In my past life, I had never known this part of the story. I had only known the frantic, tears-soaked girl in the kitchen begging me to take the blame for a minor fender bender. I had gone to a maximum security prison for 5 years, mourning a man I didn't know, believing my sister had made a tragic, careless mistake in the rain. She hadn't. She had beaten him to death in the street. So he punched your window, Miller said slowly, writing in his notebook. The scratch of the pen was loud. And then what? You just happened to find a tire iron. It was in my back seat. Sabrina cried, looking up wildly. Her eyes darted to me, desperate for an ally. Nora, tell him I always keep it on the floorboard behind my seat because the trunk latch sticks. You know this. I looked at Miller, letting my lower lip tremble. I nodded slowly, deliberately. Yes, I whispered, my voice thick with manufactured tears. She keeps it there. I grabbed it to scare him. Sabrina babbled her words, tripping over each other. Did I open the door? I just wanted him to back off. But he grabbed my arm. He pulled me. It was raining so hard I slipped. I swung it. I swear to God. Detective, I just swung it blindly. I didn't mean to hit his head. I just wanted him to let go. You hit him more than once. Sabrina, Miller stated, his voice dropping into a heavy, growly register. The coroner noted defensive wounds on his forearms and 3 distinct blunt force impacts to the cranium. That's not a blind swing. That's a beating. No, Sabrina screamed, scrambling backward until her shoulders hit the cinder block wall. No, he fell. He fell, and I dropped the iron, and I got back in my car. I was so scared. I hit the gas, but my foot slipped, and I rear-ended his bumper. I didn't know he was dead. I didn't know. She pointed a shaking, accusatory finger at me. That's why I asked her to take the blame. I knew it looked bad. I just needed time to get a lawyer. Nora, please tell him I didn't mean to. The sheer audacity of it tasted like copper on my tongue. Even now, confessing to a brutal assault, she was trying to spin it as a tragic accident, dragging me into the center of her mess to act as a character witness for her soul. I looked at her, letting real, genuine disgust bleed into my eyes. It felt incredibly liberating to drop the mask of the supportive older sister. You asked me to take the blame for a parked car. SAB, I said, my voice dead flat. The acoustics of the small room made the words hang in the air like stones. You asked me to lie to the police. You went upstairs, changed into your pajamas, and let them put me in the back of a squad car while you knew Leo was lying dead in the street. Sabrina stared at me, her mouth hanging open. The betrayal in her eyes was almost comical. She couldn't fathom a world where I didn't throw my body over the barbed wire for her to walk across. Miller closed his notebook with a sharp, decisive snap. Sabrina Gallagher, stand up. What? She pressed herself harder against the wall. No, I need to call my parents. I need my dad. You can call whoever you want. After booking, Miller said, reaching to his belt. The heavy metallic rattle of handcuffs filled the room. It was a sound that had haunted my nightmares for 7 years. The sound of a life ending. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway just as Miller pulled Sabrina to her feet. The heavy interrogation door didn't just open. It was shoved open, the handle banging sharply against the exterior wall. A wave of expensive floral perfume, Chanel No. 5, mixed with the damp, wet dog smell of soaked, flooded the small room, instantly overpowering the stale coffee and sweat. My mother Diane stood in the doorway. Her trench coat was hastily belted over a silk nightgown, her hair completely undone. Right behind her was my father, Robert, his face flushed red with indignation, a bulky golf umbrella dripping onto the precinct floor. What is the meaning of this? My mother demanded her voice, carrying the shrill, imperious tone she used on customer service representatives and wait staff. Her eyes swept the room entirely, skipping over me, sitting at the table and locked onto Sabrina. Sabrina let out a wail that sounded like a wounded animal. Mom, Mom, they're arresting me. Diane lunged forward, but a uniformed officer materialized in the doorway, putting a firm hand on her shoulder to hold her back. Ma'am, you cannot interfere. Take your hands off me. Diane snapped, shaking off the officer. She glared at Miller, who was calmly holding Sabrina's wrists together. Detective, my daughter is a medical student at Johns Hopkins. She has never been in trouble a day in her life. This is a massive misunderstanding. Whatever she hit, our insurance will cover it. Miller didn't flinch. He finished securing the cuffs around Sabrina's delicate wrists. The metal clicked shut. 1, 2. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the beautiful, terrible symmetry of the sound wash over me. In my previous life, Diane had stood in this exact precinct, wearing that exact trench coat, holding my father's arm, while I was the one wearing the steel bracelets. She had looked at me with cold, detached disappointment. How could you be so reckless? Nora, you've ruined everything. This isn't an insurance matter. Mrs. Gallagher, Miller said, smoothly, turning Sabrina around to face her parents. Sabrina's face was a ruin of running makeup and snot. Your daughter is under arrest for the murder of Leo Vance. The word murder seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. My father, who had been gearing up to bellow about lawsuits and city council connections, froze. His jaw went slack. The dripping umbrella in his hand slipped an inch. Murder. He rasped Leo, her boyfriend. They had a domestic dispute. Miller stated, his voice a steady, unyielding drumbeat. Physical evidence places Sabrina at the scene, and she has just admitted to striking the victim multiple times with a blunt object. Diane shook her head rapidly, her carefully maintained composure shattering. No, that's impossible. Sabrina doesn't have a violent bone in her body. She's a healer. She spun around, her wild eyes finally landing on me. The frantic gears in her head turned, seeking the easiest, most familiar path of least resistance, the path that had always worked before. Blame the defective child to save the golden one. Nora, she shrieked, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at me. What did you do? You were driving her car, weren't you? You're always taking her things. You did this, and you're trying to frame her. The sheer unadulterated venom in her voice didn't hurt me. It would have yesterday. It would have crushed me. But today, standing on the other side of a death I had already endured, it just felt pathetic. I stood up from the metal table. The chair scraped loudly against the linoleum. I looked my mother dead in the eye. She asked me to take the blame, Mom. I said, my voice eerily calm. She woke me up, told me she hit a parked car, and begged me to lie to the cops so she wouldn't get a DUI. And I did. I lied for her that you're a liar. Diane screamed, lunging toward me. The informed officer caught her round the waist, pulling her back as she kicked and thrashed. You've always been jealous of her. You've always tried to ruin her life. Ma'am, control yourself or I will put you in a holding cell. Miller barked his patience, finally snapping. His voice boomed off the cinder block walls. Diane froze, shocked into silence by the sheer authority in his tone. Miller pointed a thick, calloused finger at my mother. Your older daughter told us she was driving, but the blood spatter on the driver's side seat belt matches the dead kid in the street. The steering wheel has Sabrina's fingerprints embedded in her expensive hand lotion. The seat was adjusted for someone 5 feet 2 inches. Nora is 5 feet 9 inches. He paused, letting the cold, hard forensics settle over my parents like a suffocating blanket. Sabrina did this. Miller finalized, and then she went home and tried to let her sister take the fall for a homicide. Now, step out of my interrogation room. You can call a lawyer from the lobby. My father looked at Sabrina. His eyes were wide, horrified. staring at the handcuffs biting into her wrists. He wasn't looking at a medical student anymore. He was looking at a stranger. Daddy, Sabrina whimpered, pulling against Miller's grip. Daddy, please. Robert slowly backed out of the doorway. He didn't say a word. He just turned, leaving his crying wife in the hands of the officer, and walked down the brightly lit hallway toward the exit. They led her away. I watched Sabrina's back as she was escorted down the corridor toward booking. Her shoulders shook violently, her bare feet dragging on the polished floor. She looked small, pathetic, stripped of the arrogant armor she had worn her entire life. I didn't feel sorry for her. I searched my chest for a flicker of guilt, a twinge of sisterly devotion. But the cavern where those feelings used to live was completely hollowed out, filled with concrete. Sit down. Nora. Mila sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, leaving behind the bone-deep exhaustion of a graveyard shift. I sat back down in the hard plastic chair. You're not under arrest, Miller said, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. But you did lie to a police officer during an active homicide investigation. Technically, I could charge you with obstruction. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. I know. I'm sorry. I just cheesed my little sister when she told me it was just a fender bender. I panicked. I didn't want her to lose her residency. Miller studied me for a long moment. His pale blue eyes were sharp, missing nothing. I wondered what he saw. Did he see a naive, overly protective sister, or did he sense the cold, calculating stillness underneath? You're lucky she's a terrible liar. Nora, he said, quietly, doubt if she had cleaned that seatbelt. If she had wiped down that steering wheel. You'd be the one in an orange jumpsuit right now, looking at 20 to life. Your sister was perfectly willing to let you drown. I know, I whispered, and I didn't know intimately. I need an official statement. Miller continued, clicking his pen. Everything that happened from the moment she walked into your house. Leave nothing out. Once you sign it, you're free to go. It took 20 minutes. I told him everything. The smell of tequila on her breath. The exact phrasing she used to beg me. The way she had gone upstairs to change into pajamas to play the victim. I laid every nail in her coffin with precise, unwavering strikes. When I signed my name at the bottom of the statement, the pen scratching loudly in the quiet room, it felt like signing a treaty. The war of my past life was officially over. A new one had begun. Miller took the paper, sliding it into the thick manila folder. All right, you can go. Use the side exit. The press caught wind of a body on Elm Street. The front lobby is going to be a circus in about 10 minutes. I stood up. Thank you, detective. He didn't look up from his file. Don't thank me. You dodged a bullet tonight. Go home. I walked out of the interrogation room. The precinct was a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, shouting officers, and the clacking of keyboards. I navigated the maze of desks, keeping my head down, moving toward the heavy metal fire door. Marked exit. I pushed the crossbar. The door swung open, and the heavy, humid air of the early morning hit me in the face. The rain had stopped. The sky was the color of bruised plums transitioning from black to a deep, dark purple as dawn threatened to break. The air smelled of ozone-wet asphalt and the sharp, clean scent of crushed pine needles from the trees lining the parking lot. I stepped out onto the wet pavement. I was still wearing my oversized sleep shirt and shorts. I was shivering, the cold air raising goosebumps on my bare legs, but I had never felt warmer. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, ragged breath. The air filled my lungs completely. There was no sharp pain beneath my left rib. There was no smell of industrial bleach and unwashed bodies. There was no rhythmic clanging of cell doors locking down for the night. I was standing in a parking lot in a free world. A police cruiser pulled up to the Sally Port a few yards away. The back door opened and 2 officers pulled out a drunk, combative man, his hands cuffed behind his back. The metallic, rattling sound drifted over the damp air. I opened my eyes, watching them drag him inside. Sabrina was in there getting her fingerprints taken, stripping down for a cavity search. trading her silk pajamas for stiff, scratchy cotton. The reality of a concrete box was rapidly closing in on her reality she had built with her own two hands. My parents would drain their savings trying to defend her. They would hire the best lawyers, leverage every connection. But physical evidence and a recorded confession to police don't disappear just because you have a trust fund. The golden child was tarnished beyond repair. I shoved my hands into the pockets of my shorts and began to walk. I didn't have a car. My house was 5 miles away. I didn't care. I wanted to walk. I wanted to feel the gravel under my shoes, the chill of the morning wind against my neck. I had given Sabrina exactly what she asked for. I had taken the blame, and then I had let the truth wash it away. She was going to spend the rest of her life in a cage, and I was going to live. Finally, walking 5 miles on wet asphalt tears the skin right off the soles of your feet. By the time I reached the edge of our subdivision, the adrenaline had completely burned out of my system, leaving a heavy toxic sludge in my veins. My toes were scraped raw. Every step was a sharp, biting sting that radiated up my calves. I welcomed it. The pain grounded me. It kept my mind tethered to the physical world, proving that this was real, that I wasn't going to wake up back in that concrete cell with a punctured lung. Morning light doesn't cleanse a house. It just exposes everything the shadows were trying to hide. I pushed the front door open. The house was dead quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I limped inside, leaving faint, muddy footprints on the hardwood floor of the foyer. I didn't care. I walked straight into the kitchen. The empty tequila bottle still sat on the counter next to a shriveled lime wedge. A single acrylic nail, painted a glossy ballet pink, lay discarded near the sink where Sabrina had been frantically picking at her hands. I grabbed a glass from the cupboard, filled it with tap water, and drank it down in one long, desperate swallow. The water tasted metallic, heavily chlorinated. The sound of tires crushing gravel in the driveway made my shoulders pull tight. Car doors slammed. Heavy, hurried footsteps pounded up the porch stairs. Diane and Robert burst through the front door. They looked like absolute hell. My father's tie was gone. His collar unbuttoned his face, a mottled, terrifying shade of gray. My mother's trench coat was stained with rain and spilled coffee. Her hair, usually sprayed into an immovable helmet of blonde layers, hung in lank, greasy strings around her cheeks. They stopped dead when they saw me standing by the kitchen island. You. Diane breathed. IT wasn't a greeting. It was a curse. She marched across the kitchen, her heels clicking aggressively against the linoleum. Before I could brace myself, her hand lashed out. The slap cracked across my left cheekbone, sharp and stinging, leaving a blooming heat in its wake. My head snapped to the side. How could you do this? She hissed her breath, smelling of stale mints and sheer panic. How could you say those things to that detective? You condemned your own sister. I slowly turned my head back. I didn't rub my cheek. I just stared at her. The cynical detachment that had formed in my chest at the police station hardened into a solid wall of ice. I didn't condemn her mom. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, entirely stripped of emotion. Leo's blood on her seat belt did. The tire iron she threw in a storm drain did. I just stopped lying for her. You could have said you panicked. Diane screamed, spittle flying from her lips to land on my collarbone. You could have told them you were confused, that you took the car after she went to sleep, that you didn't know whose blood it was. You could have created reasonable doubt. That's what family does. My father stepped into the kitchen, leaning heavily against the doorframe. Nora, please, he said, his voice breaking. He looked incredibly old. We can hire a lawyer for you. A good one. If you just go back and amend your statement, tell them you were under duress. We can muddy the waters. Sabrina won't survive in there. You know how fragile she is. I looked between them. A bitter, ugly laugh clawed its way up my throat. It tasted like ash. Fragile. I repeated. She beat a man's skull in until his brains leaked out onto the pavement. Dad, she isn't fragile. She's a monster, and you two built her. Diane lunged for me again, her manicured hands curled into claws aiming for my face. I didn't stand still this time. I grabbed her wrists, my fingers digging hard into the thin, crepey skin of her forearms. She was weak. I pushed her backward, shoving her away with enough force that she stumbled and fell hard onto her rear, sliding against the base of the lower cabinets. Don't ever touch me again, I told her, my voice dropping an octave, carrying a dark, unfamiliar weight. Robert rushed forward to help her up, glaring at me with a mixture of hatred and profound confusion. He didn't know the woman standing in his kitchen. He only knew the compliant, invisible older daughter who absorbed the family's stress. He didn't know the ghost of a convict looking back at him. You're dead to us. Diane sobbed from the floor, clutching her husband's arm. Do you hear me? You are no daughter of mine. I know, I said. I turned my back on them and walked up the stairs. My bedroom was small, shoved at the end of the hall. I pulled a duffel bag from the closet and started throwing things into it. I grabbed my passport, my birth certificate, and the small tin box where I kept the cash I had saved for my waitress. When I walked back downstairs 10 minutes later, they were in the living room. Diane was on the phone crying hysterically to someone who sounded like a defense attorney, promising exorbitant amounts of money they didn't have. Robert was staring blankly out the front window at the rising sun. Neither of them looked at me as I walked out the front door. The heavy oak clicked shut behind me, severing the cord. I didn't look back. Courtrooms always smell like floor wax, old paper, and nervous sweat. It's a distinct, suffocating aroma that embeds itself in your clothes and hair. It had been 9 months. 9 months of grinding legal gears, media circus articles, and a suffocating, terrifying quiet in my own life. I had rented a cheap apartment 2 towns over. I worked double shifts at a diner. I paid my own rent. I slept through the night. I sat in the back row of the gallery, the hard wooden bench, digging uncomfortably into my spine. The room was packed. Leo's family took up the entire left side, a tight-knit cluster of people wearing somber black, their faces etched with a grief so profound it made the air heavy. On the right side in the second row sat my parents. I barely recognized them. The house was gone sold to pay for Sabrina's defense team. Diane's hair was completely gray, cut into a harsh, uneven bob. The expensive trench coats and Chanel perfumes had been replaced by ill-fitting blouses purchased off a discount rack. Robert had aged 20 years. He sat hunched over his hands, trembling violently in his lap, a tremor that never seemed to stop. They were broken, hollowed out by the sheer, relentless cost of trying to buy their way out of a murder charge. A heavy wooden door near the judge's bench opened. The bailiff stepped out, followed by Sabrina. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. She wore a tan blazer that was 2 sizes too big, a cheap polyester thing that hung off her emaciated frame like a sheet over a skeleton. Her blonde hair had completely grown out, leaving 6 of mousy brown roots, merging into dry split ends. Her skin was a sickly, translucent yellow, ravaged by the terrible diet of county jail and a terrifying lack of sunlight. She shuffled to the defense table. She didn't look arrogant. She didn't look like a Johns Hopkins medical student. She looked like a trapped rat, her eyes darting frantically around the room until they locked onto our parents. She offered them a weak, trembling smile. Diane choked on a sob, burying her face in her hands. Then Sabrina's gaze drifted toward the back of the room. She saw me for a fraction of a second. Her hollow eyes widened, her lips parted. I didn't break eye contact. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded loosely in my lap. I didn't offer her a smile. I didn't offer her a scowl. I just offered her absolute, terrifying nothingness. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing, and quickly looked down at the polished wooden table. The trial was a slaughter. Sabrina's high-priced attorney tried to paint a picture of a terrified girl defending herself against a violent, abusive boyfriend. He tried to claim the tire iron was a desperate measure, He talked about her grades, her future, her panic response. But the prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman in a crisp navy suit, didn't let a single lie breathe. She displayed the crime scene photos, the jagged, brutalized ruin of Leo's skull on the wet pavement. She brought out the coroner, who testified in a dry, clinical voice that the second and third blows were struck while the victim was already on the ground, incapacitated. That wasn't self-defense. That was an execution. She played Sabrina's police interrogation tape. The gallery listened in horrifying silence as my sister's voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Frantic and selfish, admitting to swinging the iron, admitting to hitting his car to make it look like an accident, admitting to trying to frame me. She didn't call 911. The prosecutor said during her closing argument, walking slowly in front of the jury box. She didn't try to stop the bleeding. She got into her car, slammed into his bumper to create an alibi, drove home, changed into her pajamas, and begged her sister to lie to the police. Ladies and gentlemen, this wasn't an accident. This was a calculated, brutal murder, followed by a cold, calculated cover-up. I watched Sabrina as the prosecutor spoke. She was weeping, her shoulders shaking violently under the ugly 10 blazer. But it wasn't the pretty practiced crying from our kitchen 9 months ago. This was ugly. Her face was red and swollen, snot running down her upper lip. She was crying because she finally realized the walls were closing in and there was no one left to take the hit for her. The jury was out for barely 4 hours. When they filed back in the room was so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents in the ceiling. We, the jury, find the defendant, Sabrina Gallagher, guilty of murder in the 2nd degree. Sabrina didn't scream. Her knees simply buckled. If her lawyer hadn't grabbed her by the arm, she would have hit the floor. She slumped against him, a dead weight, letting out a low, guttural moan that sounded like a dying engine. Diane shrieked a horrible tearing sound that echoed through the courthouse. Robert grabbed her, burying his face into her shoulder, his trembling hands gripping her cheap blouse. I sat in the back row. I didn't smile. I didn't feel a rush of victorious adrenaline. I just felt a deep, profound exhaustion settle into my bones. The phantom ache in my ribs, a ghost from a past life that had haunted me for months, finally faded away entirely. Sentencing day tasted like chalk. It coated the roof of my mouth, a dry alkaline film that no amount of lukewarm chlorine-scented courthouse water could wash away. Fluorescent lights buzzed high above, casting a jaundiced yellow pour over the heavy oak benches. I sat in the very back row of the gallery, hidden among the reporters and the curious onlookers. My cheap cotton skirt scratched uncomfortably against the backs of my bare thighs. Up at the front of the room, a stenographer tapped away on a small, weirdly shaped machine. The rapid muted clicking sounded like tiny hollow bones snapping together in quick succession. My parents sat 3 rows ahead of me. I studied the backs of their heads. Robert's shoulders were hunched so far forward he looked like a question mark, his spine seemingly permanently curved by the crushing weight of legal bills and neighborhood whispers. Diane was rocking slightly. It wasn't a comforting soothing sway, but a rigid mechanical twitch. She held a damp, crumpled tissue in her lap, her manicured nails tearing it into tiny microscopic shreds until it resembled snow. They had spent everything trying to save her, their retirement accounts, their dignity, their meticulously curated reputation. They were empty vessels now scraped hollow by the reality of what they had raised. A heavy wooden door near the judge's bench swung open. The bailiff stepped out, followed immediately by Sabrina. A collective hushed murmur rippled through the gallery. She wore the bright orange county uniform. It was stiff, industrial, and unforgiving, the coarse fabric bagged heavily around her shoulders, emphasizing how much weight she had dropped. The county lockup didn't serve organic salads or pressed juices. They served gray meat and despair. Her blonde hair, once her crowning glory, and the subject of hours in expensive salons, hung in a greasy, bicolored mess down her back. the dark brown roots growing out past her ears. When she shuffled her feet to walk toward the defense table, the heavy metal chain locked around her waist rattled against the handcuffs, securing her wrists. Clink, drag, clink. I knew that exact sound. In another timeline, a timeline that felt like a terrifying fever dream, I had miraculously woken up from those cold chains had been locked onto me. I remembered the heavy, dragging sensation of steel biting against my hip bones. I remembered standing exactly where she was standing, looking back at our parents, waiting for Diane to give me a single reassuring nod. Diane hadn't looked at me then. She had turned her face away in shame. But today, she couldn't tear her swollen, bloodshot eyes away from Sabrina. Judge Harrison adjusted his reading glasses. He was a stern, exhausted-looking man with deep vertical lines carving harsh brackets around his mouth. He didn't look at Sabrina with an ounce of pity. He looked at her the way you look at a discrepancy on a tax form. Cold, objective, tired. He shuffled a stack of dense paperwork on his elevated desk. The sharp rustling of the paper seemed to suck all the remaining oxygen out of the cavernous room. Sabrina Gallagher. Judge Harrison began. His voice was a low, growly rumble that vibrated through the polished floorboards. You took a human life in a fit of unrestrained rage. You beat an unarmed man until his skull fractured, and you left him to die in the rain on a wet street. Sabrina squeezed her eyes shut. A single pathetic whimper escaped her throat, dying quickly in the vast silence of the courtroom. But what this court finds most disturbing, the judge continued, leaning forward, his gaze pinning her to the floor, is not just the profound brutality of the act itself, but the chilling, calculated lack of remorse that followed. You did not call for medical assistance. You deliberately damaged your own vehicle to manufacture an alibi. You returned to your home, changed your clothes, and actively attempted to coerce your own sister into bearing the legal and moral consequences of your horrific actions. You treated the justice system and your own family with absolute, staggering contempt. He paused. The silence in the room was suffocating. You could hear a pin drop. You could hear Diane's ragged, hitching breath fighting its way out of her throat. Therefore, the court finds absolutely no grounds for leniency. I sentence you to 25 years to life in a state correctional facility. You are remanded to the custody of the Department of Corrections immediately. Crack! The wooden gavel hit the sounding block. It was a sharp, definitive strike. It sounded exactly like a heavy deadbolt sliding into place, locking away a quarter of a century. Sabrina's knees folded. She didn't gracefully faint. She simply lost the physical ability to hold her skeleton upright. Two baifs, heavy-set men with thoroughly bored expressions, caught her by the armpits before she hit the floor. They hauled her back to her feet, their grips tight and unyielding against her fragile frame. Diane unleashed a scream. It was a raw, tearing noise that scraped painfully against the high ceilings. Robert buried his face in his hands, finally breaking his chest, heaving with silent, ugly, uncontrollable sobs. The bailiffs turned Sabrina toward the side door, the heavy metal slab that led back to the holding cells. As they dragged her away, her unlaced canvas shoes stumbling over the polished floor, she turned her head over her shoulder. She looked past the screaming woman who gave birth to her. She looked past the broken, bankrupt man who had funded her every whim. She looked directly at me. I met her gaze over the heads of the weeping crowd. Her eyes were completely flat. The vibrant, arrogant spark that used to define her very existence was entirely extinguished. She looked hollowed out. She looked like an inmate. I recognized that terrifying blank stare because I used to see it in my own reflection, staring back at me from a metal mirror. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel a rush of victorious adrenaline. I just offered her a slow, barely perceptible nod and acknowledgement. This cage is yours. You built it. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly before the baif shoved her through the door. It slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud that rattled the hinges. I didn't wait for my parents to turn around. I didn't want to engage in whatever messy, grief-stricken accusations they might try to hurl my way in the lobby. I stood up from the hard wooden bench, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt. I turned my back on the courtroom and walked out through the heavy double doors at the rear. The hallway was excessively bright, flooded with stark midday sunlight pouring through the tall security windows. The smell of floor wax faded, replaced immediately by the faint, stale scent of exhaust fumes wafting up from the busy city streets below. I pushed through the main exit doors and stepped out onto the wide concrete steps of the courthouse. The heat of the afternoon sun hit my face, heavy, thick, and undeniably real. I paused on the top step. Below me, the city rushed by in a blur of motion. Yellow taxis honked. Pedestrians were round each other on the cracked sidewalks. A siren wailed in the far distance, a high, frantic scream weaving through the concrete canyons. It didn't sound like a dentist's drill grinding against my nerves anymore. It just sounded like the city. It sounded like a normal Wednesday. I took a deep, deliberate breath. My lungs expanded fully, pushing outward against my ribs, taking in the polluted, wonderful living air. There was no sharp pain beneath my left rib cage, no phantom shiv waiting in the dark. I had survived. I hadn't saved anyone, and I certainly hadn't emerged from the wreckage as a hero with clean hands. I had just refused for the very first time to be the sacrifice on the altar of my sister's ego. And as I walked down those concrete steps, disappearing completely into the chaotic, anonymous crowd on the sidewalk, I finally realized something profound. I was free. Thank you for listening to this raw, unforgettable journey. If Nora's dark, cynical path to survival kept you hooked, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Share this video with anyone who loves intense, grounded revenge stories without the cliché fluff. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss out on our next deeply human storytelling experience. What would you have done in Nora's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next.